Yeah, I don't have a copy of Jorge's Vita or anything like that in front of my eyes or anything, but I want you all to know his history with us. He worked with IDR for many years. We have done a lot of organizing together with around anti-racism. He's one of the finest anti-racism trainers I've met. And the first time he gave his presentation to us, and it's nice to see it on PowerPoint, Jorge. I think when I saw it, you had like flimsy sheets on an overhead projector back in the day.
Yeah, transparencies.
Yeah, and before that, it was chiseled on stone, I think. But it
Wow.
was eye-opening. It was very eye-opening, and really pieced a whole lot of history together for me, and made me go and immediately read a couple books. But I just found it really, really helpful, and I'm really proud of Jorge. I'm proud of his work, and glad that he's back down here in North Carolina to fight this fight along with us here. You got your registration in, and I saw that you had already voted this morning. Thank you, Jorge, for doing your part.
Yeah.
So, be sensitive, because, we may have a few Trumpers on our call tonight. No, I'm doubting it. I really doubt it. All right. But I want to turn it over to Jorge Zeballos. Jorge, thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate it. I was really glad that you and Maria connected with your work already with Wake Forest. So.
Yeah, thank you. As I was saying, it feels good. It feels good. It feels like coming back to old friends and reconnecting. So thank you for inviting me back into the community. I really appreciate that. And I can't remember, other than Kelly, how many of you may have seen this presentation before, but if you did, it's been a few years. So a little bit of a refresher if you've already seen it. I have just a couple of new slides that you'll see at the end to bring into more contemporary information. The presentation, just came about to me as a result of doing my own work around my own racial identity and being at a point in my life where I had not really paid a whole lot of attention to issues of race growing up, and nevertheless, these issues were there. And it's in that exploration that I began to piece things together in a way that I hadn't before, and went beyond just my personal experience and story to begin to look at, some of you may remember, I grew up in Peru. So my experience growing up in Peru and looking at the history of the country, and then looking at the history of Latin America, and it just became this bigger piece that once I pieced it together, I just felt compelled to share. It was the kind of thing that I knew it was important for other people to also hear that story. So what you're going to see today, and it's an abbreviated version just because of time. I have enough slides and enough information to do a 2-hour presentation. So maybe another time we can get to that. But this is an abbreviated version that captures the essence of what that history is. And to begin to talk about the history of race in Latin America, we have to talk about Spain, because the concept of race, as we know it, was actually imported into Latin America from Spain. The indigenous communities that existed before the colonizers arrived in the Americas did not really think about issues of race. That was not a concept that they held in any way. So we have to begin to understand what was going on in Spain and what developed there that eventually made its way to Latin America through the voyages of the colonizers. We just recently held a day, right, that used to be a celebration of this myth of discovery, but now we appropriately retitled that as Indigenous Peoples Day. But it's connected to the whole story, right? So what was going on in Spain, and Spain was occupied in the early 8th century by people from Northern Africa, known as the Moors. They were dark-skinned people, Muslims, And these two things become really important in what develops as a result of that occupation. The Moors occupied Spain for roughly about 800 years. And at the time of the occupation, Spain was not a nation. It was simply a mixture of different kingdoms. So there was no country of Spain at the time. The other thing that is also, this is a little bit of an aside, but it's interesting, at the time in which the Moors come into Spain, it is during the period in European history known as the Dark Ages. And what happens as a result of the arrival of the Moors is that the Moors set up the most advanced civilization that exists anywhere in the world at that time. One of the other ways to conceptualize what that really means is Europe is in the Dark Ages. You have the most advanced civilization that is set up by Northern Africans. That means that Northern Africans actually civilized Europe. Right? It's not how we talk about it, but part of what we do in our work is to reframe how we have been taught history, right? So just a little bit of an aside there. But the kingdoms that were part of this peninsula of Spain that were not dominated by the Moors, they were mostly in the northern part of Spain, they began to band together and began a campaign to push the Moors out of Spain. It is in that context that you begin to see language and framing that comes from the higher places of the political and religious hierarchy. Because remember, at that time, politics and religion are one and the same. They're not separated as we know them today, at least in the United States, right? So you begin to see this frame, this mental imagination that begins to develop around the presence of Muslims, darker skinned people, and how they begin to talk about those individuals as they begin to try to recover their territory. The campaign was known as La Reconquista in Spain. So this is what I mean by the language. So what you see here is language that comes from the Pope at the time. In 1095, Pope Urban II said that the faithful should hasten to exterminate this vile race from the lands of Christians. And it would be a disgrace if a race so despised, base, and the instrument of demons to so overcome a people endowed with faith in the all-powerful God and resplendent with the name of Christ. So a couple of things about this statement. I just finished telling you that the Moors set up the most advanced civilization that exists anywhere in the world at that time. And yet the Pope is actually talking about them as if they are instrument of demons. It's a race that is so despised and base. Right, so that description doesn't match what I just told you about the Moors. It's actually very much the opposite. But it is also one of the ways, again, in which you consistently see throughout history that those in power have the ability to tell stories about other people through their own lens and for their own purposes. So reframing the Moors as this really despicable group of people that hold no culture at all, right? And what's interesting to me also is that the language that the Pope uses is very violent, which is not what you would expect of a religious leader, right? He's not saying, let's send these people back to where they came from. This is our land, which could be a good argument to have. He says, let's exterminate them. So just think about that, right? So this is the language that comes from the Pope, the highest individual in the hierarchy, the political religious hierarchy of the time. And he's also using the term race. So he is clearly trying to say these people are different than we are. Right? So this concept of that difference, and the difference being a negative one for those that are not like us, begins to now be part of the mental imagination of the people of Spain. Then we reach another moment in 1478. Pope Sixtus IV issues a bull empowering King Ferdinand V and Isabella I to purify the people of Spain. This bull, papal bull, is what gave rise to the Inquisition, the persecution of non-Christians who were thought of having bad blood, not pure blood. So again, now you begin to bring in some biological expectations of who people are. So now you have the concept of race, the concept of difference as a negative one for those that don't look like us, and now you have biology on top of that. So this idea of purity of blood, believe it or not, is a concept that is still present throughout Latin America. There are still people that will be talking about their purity of blood, which for them really means I'm white. And that's what it really amounts to. So that is still very much present. And of course, after 1478, we reach a critical moment in that history of colonization, 1492, the voyage of Columbus sailing the ocean blue, as that little ditty will say, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. He was in search of India, got lost, and landed on the island of Hispaniola, thinking that he landed in India. And that's why we call those people Indians. So, it's interesting to me, again, that we have celebrated an individual that got lost. So what's the accomplishment? To get lost? Right? But never mind, that's just an observation on my part. But 1492 is a critical moment, right? So the Spaniards arrive now with also what is not here is a series of papal bulls that basically give the Christians that are on these voyages of discovery the right to claim any land that is not owned and occupied by Christians. Now you think about that, right? What entitlement do you have that you are actually saying to these folks that are on these ships going to other lands that if you don't find any Christians, and what are the chances that you're going to find Christians in other places, right? If you don't find any Christians, you have the right by God to claim that land for ourselves, for our kingdom. So this series of papal bulls is known as the doctrine of discovery, which is, actually very insidious in its impact over the centuries, really, because even in the United States in the 1800s, it is a case that is decided in the Supreme Court on land owned by Native Americans against land owned by a white family. And basically the Supreme Court says, well, we have to decide on the side of the white family because by the doctrine of discovery, Indians cannot own land. So imagine that, right? The Supreme Court is actually citing the doctrine of discovery as legal precedent for assigning ownership of land. And the same thing actually has happened in Latin America. And to this day, it is still used as a legal argument. So 1492. So the arrival of Columbus, what it leads to eventually is the creation of these territories called viceroyalties. And there are two main places in Latin America that the Spaniards, the Spanish kingdom, set up these viceroyalties. One is Mexico, the other one is Peru. So here you have this map of Central America, including North America. And you can see here, this is the viceroyalty of New Spain. They had to rename it, right? New Spain eventually added territories to the south and to the north. So look at this. This is actually part of what is currently known as the United States. So at some point, the Kingdom of Spain also owned land in what is known as the United States today, which is sometimes a piece of information that folks don't have. The other area, again, is Peru, and then eventually added other parts of Latin America. Not Brazil, or at least the area that is known as Brazil today, that was occupied by Portugal. So the Portuguese kingdom, had that part of Latin America. They divided it under a treaty as if it was their own land. There were no people there, according to them, so they could just divide it. What happened as a result of the establishment of these viceroyalties is that then the political, economic, social, and cultural life was turned upside down for the indigenous peoples of these territories, because what was put in place had no connection to the worldview, the cultural ways of being, the spiritual ways of being of the indigenous population. And for those individuals that would resist this new order, this is what would happen. They would be burnt alive, to be made examples. So the resistance would be tampered down. Now, one of the things that I want to mention, because we're doing this within the context of a faith community, I want you to pay close attention to the role that the church played in this process of colonization. It was very much hand in hand. This is a statement from a critical figure during the colonial time, Juan Ginés de Sepúlveda, who said, "Indians are by nature rude and inferior, for being without exception rude people, born with limited intelligence, thus classified as servia natura. In Latin, that means you're born to serve. They must serve their superiors and their natural masters, the Spanish. There are people of inherent rudeness, of retarded comprehension, little men in which you will find only a few traces of humanity." So right off the bat, actually, if you read some of the diaries of Columbus, you know, the dehumanization of indigenous people is immediately where they go. But again, remember that it started in 1095, talking about a race so despised, based in the instrument of demons, right? Those are different than us. So now they encountered another different group, and the only logical conclusion now that they can reach is that these are not even human beings. And that message is consistent through colonial time, and I would say even to the current contemporary time, in terms of how we talk particularly about indigenous people. This is a picture of, again, what was done to indigenous people that resisted the new order. So one of the things that we know also just from historical records and from accounts is that there was a significant death rate in the indigenous population, mostly from exposure to diseases that were not natural to that part of the world that the Spaniards brought with them. So it's a biological warfare, not necessarily an intentional one, but nevertheless, it is one of the ways in which huge numbers of indigenous people died because of that exposure to those diseases. But it is not the only way. Right? Sometimes that's the only way in which people want to talk about what happened to indigenous people. This also is another way in which indigenous people were actually killed, intentionally killed in this case, right? This is from the Kingdom of Guatemala, and here you see actually little kids and women being thrown into a pit to be burnt alive. So the resistance was met with some fierce tactics of intimidation. This is a painting that hangs at the colonial church in the capital of Ecuador, in Quito. So it is a historical building, a historical church. And the moment you walk in, the first thing you're gonna see to your left, huge painting hanging on the wall, is this painting. Now, here's the thing about this. I don't have a problem using this as a historical documentation of what happened and how Spaniards actually documented their own imposition of a new order, their own sort of genocide on indigenous people, but it should not be at a church. The fact that the church holds this is extremely troubling and extremely telling to the continued alliance of the church with that rhetoric of a discovery of the civilization of indigenous people, which is one of the things that the church supported, right? So here what you have is colonizers setting dogs loose to maul indigenous men. This is another statement from Francisco de Vitoria, who said, they, Indians, are not capable of governing themselves, are not even more capable than wild animals and beasts, from whom they do not differ even in eating more tender or better food than they do. So again, notice that just a constant refrain of, these are not human beings. Now, why is Francisco de Vitoria an important figure? Why am I mentioning his particular statement? Francisco de Vitoria is the founder of international law, what eventually gives rise to the United Nations and all those sort of treaties, international treaties, and the way we think about relationships among nations. Francisco de Vitoria was the founder of international law. So now you find schools of law in Italy, in Spain, named after him. So this is another way, right? So we actually celebrate, we actually glorify these historical figures without really taking into account that this is the mindset that many of them held. This is another one from Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo, who said Indians do not even have heads like other people. Their heads are more like thick helmets. The main warning Christians are given when they fight against them is not to stab them in the head because the blades will break. Now that's just pure nonsense, right? But it is another way in which I can continue to portray these individuals as not being human beings, because if it is true that if I try to stab them in the head, my blade will break, that means they're not human. Right? This is another statement from Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who is actually a person that very much tried to advocate for indigenous people. He said, the child of a Negro and an Indian is called mulatto or mulata, and their sons are called cholos. It means dog, not of the best breed, but of the worst breed. And the Spanish used the term to disgrace and condemn. Now that term cholo, in Peru, in Bolivia, in Ecuador, in Colombia, it is used today in a couple of ways. It could be used as a term of endearment. So you can call somebody that you feel close to, a good friend, you know, my cholo. Or even if you're in an intimate relationship with a person, you can call him mi cholito, mi cholita, you know, which is a term of endearment for your loved partner. But it also is used as an insult. If you find somebody of indigenous descent, you can actually use the term cholo to insult them. So we are very conflicted in terms of that term, but this is the origin of the term. Cholo means dog, not of the best breed, but of the worst breed. Now, this is a table that shows you the distribution of enslaved Africans in the Americas during the Atlantic trade. Now, one of the things that I have experienced over the years in doing presentations across the country with different audiences, I ask the question all the time. When you think about slavery, what are the two parts of the world that immediately come to mind as being the main players in this slavery process? And 99% of the people will say the United States and Africa. Now, if you look at this table, though, the United States received only 4.6% of enslaved Africans. Only 4.6%. That means that the vast majority of enslaved Africans ended up in the rest of the Americas, which includes Central America, the Caribbean, and Latin America. So why is it that the way we have learned about this process of slavery seems to center that experience only around the United States and Africa? That is a historical untruth. But yet, in the United States, it seems to carry water as if it's a complete story. So, you know, one of the things we need to begin to then do is reconstitute that idea of what does the process of enslaving Africans really meant? It meant that the vast majority of enslaved Africans ended up in Latin America. It means that the vast majority of people of African descent outside of Africa are actually based in Brazil. So again, a lot of other reconstruction of the way we understood history. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is that the presence of Africans in the Americas, in Latin America, did not just come through the process of slavery. As a matter of fact, there is this book that was published many years ago. They came before Columbus. Ivan van Sertima, an anthropologist, did extensive research that documented the voyages that existed between Africa and Latin America, indigenous America, before Columbus arrived, for centuries before. So the fact is that, you know, even if we try to say, well, it was a discovery because it was the first time the Spaniards knew this land existed, well, it isn't, okay? Because if you want to credit somebody for discovering this continent, maybe you want to credit the Africans, right? Because they got there first before. So again, long established trade routes between indigenous America and Africa. So there were some settlements of African descendant people in the Americas before the slavery process started. So this picture that you see here is of an Olmec statue from Mexico. Clearly African features in this statue. So that demonstrates that there was a settlement of African descendant people in Mexico before Columbus arrived. Now, a critical piece in understanding how race and racism played out in Latin America is this caste system. So the Spaniards, they were few in number compared to the indigenous people and the enslaved Africans that they brought into the Americas. So because they were in the minority, they had to devise a system in which they could actually divide and conquer those below them because they're the majority. If the indigenous population and the Black population decide to come together, they could overturn the system very quickly just by the sheer numbers. But they don't, because the Spaniards very cleverly designed these caste systems in Mexico and in Peru that had 14 or 16 categories. That was a very effective tool in creating division all down the line, so that those alliances that would have been possible were not possible anymore because people were fighting against each other to see who was higher than the other. So we're going to examine the one in Mexico. And here you have these categories, 16 categories. And if you notice, the very first one is Spaniard and Indian beget mestizo. Where is the pure-blooded white Christian Spaniard? Of course, this list is not meant to control them. They are the ones putting it in place. So they don't put themselves in the categories, but everybody knows that they are on top. They are at the top of the hierarchy without naming it. In some ways, this is an interesting point. In some ways, similar to how whiteness was invisible in the United States, they made whiteness invisible in Latin America by not naming it, even though implicitly everyone knew that it was up there. Now, what's interesting also among the Spaniards, they even created some internal classifications among themselves. So there were the pure white Christian Spaniards born in Spain. They were called peninsulares. You mean from the peninsula of Spain? And then there were the pure-blooded white Christian Spaniards, no mixture, but born in Latin America. They were called criollos. So even among themselves, they created some hierarchy. Not put it in the official caste system, but they knew that you were a little bit less if you were white Spaniard born in Latin America. Again, looking at the list of names that they came up for these different mixtures, you begin to see once again the dehumanization, the animalization of the different mixtures. So immediately as you reach, for example, number 4, Spanish woman and Negro beget mulatto. Mulatto means a mule. So immediately number 4 becomes a mule. Morisco, number 5, is a black horse. Number 8, lobo, is a wolf. Number 12, barcino, is a pig. Number 13, coyote. You know what that is, right? So all these are animal names for these mixtures. Now notice the other thing that happened is there is no racialized language as we know racialized language, right? So it's not saying you are black, you are white, it's naming a completely new category of people, not using racialized language, but nevertheless, the categories are very much race-based, even though they're not using race-based language. So this caste system continues to pretty much control our mental imagination around the place that different people occupy in our societies. We may not use some of this terminology, although we still talk about someone being mulatto, someone being mestizo, someone being maybe sambo, which maybe is number 9, sambago. You can leave that to sambo. But we use similar, different terminology these days, but nevertheless, always rearranging ourselves in a hierarchical way. So that mindset that was started back in the 18th century through the establishment of this legal caste system has continued to influence how we see ourselves in Latin America. Now, the last thing I want to mention about this is that it was a legal classification. So that meant that for each of these categories, there were restrictions in terms of what you had access to, dependent on your category. So if you belong to, let's say, number 3 or number 4, that meant that you could only occupy certain professions, you could only live in certain parts of town, you could only marry certain kinds of people, you could only wear certain type of clothing. So it was very intrusive in terms of your personal life. Now, you can imagine that it was pretty much impossible to implement in a very precise way. But you know what? That wasn't really so much what was important. What was important is you influence the mind of people. That was the real impact of this legal caste system. All right, we're going to move through a few more, and then I'm going to wrap it up quickly so we can engage in some Q&A. This is Juan Vicente de Pacheco in 1794. The Negroes have disfigured and deteriorated the Indian caste in many ways and have given rise to all the ugly castes that can be seen in these kingdoms. So also, as much as there is a deeply dehumanizing discourse that has developed around the indigenous population, it is just as brutal and dehumanizing towards Black people, just as brutal. The town council of Caracas in 1796, the burghers and natives of America know ever since their birth, or by the experiences of many years, what an immense distance separates whites from pardos being Black, dark people, the advantage and superiority of the former, and the baseness and subordination of the latter. Another one from the Council of the Indies, it would be utterly reprehensible if those known to be sons and descendants of slaves sat down with those who derive from the first conquistadores or families that are noble, legitimate, white, and free from an ugly stain. I mean, the language was not subtle in any way, was just as blatant and as offensive and rude and dehumanizing as you can be. Quickly talk about Jose Vasconcelos, who was an intellectual, diplomat, an educator, very much revered in Mexico. He published his book, La Raza Cósmica, in which he makes an argument in his book that Latin America has actually reached a whole new phase of race relations that is an example to the rest of the world because we have mixed with each other and there is no racism that exists. We actually get along really well, which is why he used the term La Raza Cósmica. You know, we're a cosmic race. We're just wonderfully mixed people that get along and everything's fine. Now, nothing that I've shared with you up to this point tells you that that's actually the case, right? So there's some kind of, you know, mythical imagination that he's using to be able to make that argument. But here's the thing, this book becomes a major bestseller in Latin America, and it is still, to this day, considered a seminal book. Right? This idea of mestizaje, of the mixing of the races, is something that we have used to bypass any conversation about racism in Latin America. Now, even in this book, right, he makes that argument, but then in the same year, in 1925, the National Bank of Mexico publishes a report on the state of the economy, in which they say that the economy of Mexico is in trouble. And one of the main reasons why it's in trouble is the indigenous population of Mexico. And the Bank of Mexico, which is the government, proposes 3 solutions. Number 1, the extermination of the inferior race. This is in the official report of the National Bank of Mexico. I have a copy of that report, by the way. Number 2, the promotion of European immigration, because the idea was always, and continues to be to this day in Latin America, that if we promoted European immigration, maybe we can get a better breed of people, because these people locally are not good enough for us to build a civilization. And then the third solution that they propose is the incorporation of the naturals to civilization. Again, how could Vasconcelos, the same year, 1925, make the argument that Latin America is a paradise of race relations when this is how we talk about them. There's just no connection to the reality on the ground. This is the reality on the ground. This is a cartoon from Peru portraying a Peruvian soccer player who is known as one of the best soccer players in Peru, Alejandro Villanueva. And this is how he is portrayed. He is actually scaring 3 white men. One is running away. The other one is hiding behind this guy. They're all afraid of him. He seems very menacing, doesn't look human, right? Here's another picture of the same man. How different from the first picture. Now he looks like a monkey, like an orangutan here. No relation to the other one. So if I just show you these, if you didn't know who this man was, you couldn't tell from the cartoon. This is what he really looked like. And notice that there is no connection in any way to what this man really looks like. So the cartoonists are using their own mental imagination for what black men look like in their heads, which is not a human being. This is from a book that I believe continues to be used in Chile to teach little kids in elementary school about Africa. Title of the book is Little Black Sambo. And of course, you can tell that this is extremely problematic. And this is a picture of the little black Sambo with mom and dad. This is being used again in Chile in educational institutions today. This is in 1994. This is Amilcar Argüelles in Argentina, making a statement about immigration from Peru and from Bolivia of indigenous people. He says, as a result of this immigration, a decline in the intellectual capacity of our population due to underdeveloped migrations would condemn the country to a truncated and partial state of development. That's just a statement. There is no evidence. There's no scientific evidence that that's what's going to happen. He's actually the minister of education or health at that time. So at least if you occupy that position, if you have a position about something, you should back it up with some scientific evidence, right? But no, he could just say this out loud and be taken as a truth because we've already been mentally prepared to believe that that is actually possible. This is from a bag of charcoal being sold in Peru today. Negrito, called little black one, or it can also be, interpreted a different way, a word that I will not use, but you can imagine what that word might look like. But again, this is a bag of charcoal being sold in Peru today. This is a candy bar being sold in Mexico. This image on the left is from the 1950s. This is started in the 1970s. They shifted the picture of the black person. Even the facial features are not telling, except for the big afro. Right? But notice how it was described before or portrayed before. This is from a menu of a restaurant in Mexico also. Again, little black person. This is a bag of flour being sold in the Dominican Republic. And here the picture of a black man as a butler, because that's also a stereotypical role of black men. They're always serving families, right? So images that continue to perpetuate stereotypes. This is from a TV show that was made in Peru. Is a comedy show, supposedly, portraying an indigenous woman that looks like this, speaks awful Spanish, curses all the time. That was the premise of the comedy. There's nothing comedic in that premise that I just shared with you, but nevertheless, it is presented as a comedy show. Now, it was just recently, I think maybe about a year ago, banned from Peruvian television, finally. I'm going to bypass some of this. This is a woman in Chile also using blackface to portray a black person during a play for little kids. This is a cake being sold by a bakery in Argentina, in the capital, in Buenos Aires. Now, Buenos Aires has a very small, I believe is maybe 3 or 4% black population. But nevertheless, in the capital, there's a bakery that sells this cake, and this is the most popular cake that they sell, is called La Negrita, Little Black Woman. Now, why in the world in Argentina, it has such a small Black population, a cake like this will be the most popular cake? You know, we can engage in that conversation, right? This is from a chain of restaurants in Venezuela called Black Man's Meals. This is the logo of the restaurant as a chain. So there's several locations across Caracas. And I was there back in 2006 when I took this picture. So last two, this is from 2009. The president of Peru at that time, Alan Garcia, said, Indians are not first-class citizens. This is 2009, people, right? And then most recently in Brazil, the current president, pretty much a copy of our current president here in the United States, Jair Bolsonaro, said, Indians have changed, they have evolved, and they are increasingly becoming human beings like us. This is in 2020. So again, you know, we'll wrap it up with that. I gave you a whole lot of information. I want to just engage in some conversation. What's jumping at you? What questions you have? If you just want to vent for a minute, I'm okay with that too. I'm sure it evokes a lot of emotional reactions, but let me just open up just to see what's happening. What do you want to share in this conversation?
Jorge, I wanted to mention a couple of things. Two things jumped out at me at your presentation that jumped out at me in years past. One was I had gone to South Africa in 2009, and you know, they shaped the apartheid system on a racial hierarchy as well. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there was they would make laws according to the hierarchy. You know, if you were Indian born, from India, you would have a certain amount of privileges given to you. If you were, you know, if you were of the colored community, which there it's not derogatory, but it was of mixed descent, and you know, there was a different kind of thing. All the time when we were in South Africa, we ended up going to this restaurant, and it was called Spur. And the Spur restaurant is a lot like the restaurant Azars or Big Boy that, you know, we used to have up in the Midwest. I remember back in the day when Azars were also called Sambos. Mm-hmm. And that was the character. So seeing that come back, you know, in your portrayal, and it popped out of my head. But in Spur, this is in South Africa. Mm-hmm. The character, the cartoon character that they had was a Native American. Oh. It was a strange fetish that they had. This sort of it was sort of this a fetish about Native Americans all the way in South Africa, and it was this sort of this exchange. For them, it was sort of this heroic figure, but not so much you know, the grotesque caricatures that you had shown, but you could just see those kind of things being portrayed. It was somehow an exotic way of, you know, this basically fast food that you'd sit down and eat in a restaurant. But yeah, so some of those, a lot of that was real present there. And it made me think of this presentation that you had given again. And, you know, this is something that is, it's more international than we have imagined because of only seeing it through the eyes in the United States. And so again, I really appreciate the scope of this. It makes me, I got to go dig up some history books again. So, yeah.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah. Others.
So I have the same painful, angry, sad reaction today than I did when I saw the presentation before. And it makes me, you know, it makes me think about, and like Kelly, pull more books, mm-hmm. You know, the horrific power of colonialism. And being from Puerto Rico, an island that has been colonized twice, first mm-hmm. by the Spaniards and then the US, and still a colony, yep. You know, it really, it just takes my breath away. And when we talked about los peninsulares y los criollos, right? I think about, well, we like to think about only, you know, in America, this racism is perpetuated, but we do it within our own, because I'm clear that as a Boricua, born and raised in Puerto Rico, and my Puerto Rican siblings in East Harlem, there is this big difference, and we treat each other very, very differently, and often very bad, because we call our siblings, our Puerto Rican siblings in New York City, New Yorkers, less than, because you're not from the island.
Right.
And
Right.
so, you know, that happens even within our very own, and the whole issue of colorism that exists within our African American siblings is very, very much present in our Hispanic Latinx communities and cultures. But one of the things that also strikes me is that that this advertising and this marketing tools are still very present today.
Absolutely.
And so my question is, are there any movements within our Latin American countries standing against this blatant perpetuation of racism and dehumanizing of our people?
Yeah.
Is anything happening? And I remember, and we talked about Latin American liberation theology with Gustavo Gutierrez, John Sobrino, and all of these people. But in 2020, this is still happening.
Yeah.
No different than the US.
Yeah.
So I'm stuck in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, right? So, you know, a couple of things, right? So one, just like in the U.S. too, right? The sort of the history of resistance in the U.S. Resistance was there from day one and has continued to be there, right? A lot of times we don't have access to it because these are not necessarily folks that are able to tell their stories in a way that is widely accessible. So, you know, the resistance of the indigenous communities in Latin America was there from day one, as you can see from those pictures where they were being burnt alive, but also has continued. And I would say maybe in the last 15, 20 years, it became a lot more organized. So now you have organized indigenous communities that can actually topple governments, particularly in Bolivia and Ecuador. If the presidents that come into power in those countries are not working hand in hand with those representatives of those indigenous communities, those communities will take over the country and will shut it down. It has happened in Ecuador in the last 8 years or so, twice. So yes, it's a more recent phenomenon. I would say the last 10, 15 years, and also Black communities that have begun to organize. Not just locally in terms of country, but regionally. Right? So now there are gatherings, annual gatherings of people of Black descent in Latin America. So the voices are becoming much more organized and are gaining more political power and influence. But it's still very much a new phenomenon, right? The process of colonization has been so deep that to this day, there are folks that don't even acknowledge that we still live in colonized mentality. The battles for independence in all of Latin America were not battles of independence to actually reassert indigenous rule. It was actually to assert Criollo rule, which again is the white Spaniards born in Latin America. That's the elite. That, for the Peninsulares, sometimes they would move back to Spain, right? It's like, hey, you can have this. I'm going back to my country. For the Criollos, they were born there. So this is it. I'm staying here. But we control everything. So now we don't want control from the queen and king. We want to keep control here, but we're not giving it back to the indigenous people. So all the independence movements throughout Latin America were actually the Spanish elites that were born in Latin America that drove those battles for independence. And the last thing I want to say in terms of that sort of colonial mentality, I have a WhatsApp chat group with folks from my high school that I graduated with. So just on Monday, one of my friends in this group posted, "Happy Discovery Day," and I had to go in. I just had to go in. I was like, "No, take that back. We're not celebrating that, right?" Mm-hmm. And he lost his mind for a minute, because all I was saying is, first of all, there was no discovery. That's a myth. And second of all, there's nothing to celebrate. And he immediately went, "Well, we can't blame the current Spaniards for." It's like, wait a minute, who said anything about blaming anybody? That was not my point, right? And so he got so defensive. I think eventually he heard me a little bit. He started questioning some things now. But it's just an example, even today in this particular moment. And these are folks that come from a school, and I know their trajectory. These are highly educated people, right? To some extent, even progressive politically. And yet that mindset is so deeply embedded that a person like that can still say, "Hey, Columbus, yay." It's like, no, I'm sorry. You're so out of date, my friend. We got to bring you up to the 21st century. Anyway, other questions, reflections.
I was just noticing that, as I did before, I was reminded a lot, but also how similar some early cartoons in the US, particularly in the South, were almost exactly the same. So I'm thinking, okay, they appropriated that too, right? In some ways, or I should say we. That just struck me again as being, where have I seen this before? It's distressing. It's just really distressing.
Yeah, and again, maybe even connecting that, Judy, with the point that Kelly made in his own statement. It is striking when you begin to look at how racism has played out in different parts of the world, and all of a sudden, even though you wouldn't think that there's any connection, any linkage, but then you see similarities in terms of the images, the language, the description. It was like, wow, are you kidding me? Way over there? Like, how did that happen, right? But my point is, one is you got to remember that process of colonization came from Europe. So I would say it didn't matter if you were in Spain, if you were in England, if you were in Holland, right? All these places that colonized, Belgium, right? The mindset was the same. So the images, no question, why they would look very similar. Right? Anyway.
Yeah. And the other piece that I was reminded of again was, I have some friends in Peru, and also a friend here who's from Colombia. And they have all told me that their mothers told them to marry up, which meant somebody whiter.
Absolutely.
And so that whole idea of skin tone and shade within the communities, it seems like it's everywhere.
Yeah, and
it doesn't make it good, but
one thing I didn't mention in terms of the caste system is that thing that you just mentioned about marrying up. Right? It became a phrase that is widely used in Latin America even today. So, mejorando la raza.
Mejorando la raza.
Hay que mejorar la raza. We have to improve the race. Now, in that phrase alone, you don't get to hear like what race needs to be improved, why, and how. But everybody in Latin America would hear it and know exactly what you mean. It means marrying white. That's what it means. Right? Hay que mejorar la raza. Like, wait a minute. Right? So it's how deeply embedded that became that even we don't have to spell it all out anymore. We just use some enough information in there for all to get. Wink, wink, we're talking about whiteness, right? Okay, cool. We're good with that. To this day, people talk about it that way.
Jorge, some mutual friends of ours, went to one of your presentations, and this was years ago. I twisted their arm to get them present there, and you had passed out the some sheets about the caste system, and I had showed it to them because with all the animal names for all these different castes, and they were saying to me, well, we don't really have a race problem, as Latinos, and I said. Yeah. Do you know about this? And they go, oh yeah, that, they're fierce advocates, anti-racist advocates now and all of that. But I think that was part of the experience about in coming to the United States. It changes, the racism changes, the different, categories. And so, so many immigrants that came around the time about 20 years ago, 2000, the millions that came into the United States, a lot of them would, when they got to designate themselves on any kind of forms, would claim that they were white.
Yes, absolutely.
Because they were trying to move into a caste system that was not Black. And so there's that issue going on, but the complexities about thinking about all those countries, and then noticing that in that other slide that you showed, it takes different shapes in different countries. The caste system is different. It's very interesting. Yeah, so very complex.
So Jorge, what's the difference between Brazil, Salvador de Bahia, and the other Latin American countries and Caribbean islands?
Well, see, again, Brazil has a slightly different history around this because, like I said, they have the largest concentration of African descendant people outside of Africa. So because of that, then the system that they had to create was different. As a matter of fact, we think that 14 or 16 is such a stretch, right? It's like, what are you talking about? Like the most minute difference, oh, you're here now. Oh, you're here now, right? Well, guess what? In Brazil, they have over 200 categories, right? Over 200 categories. So, so it became a much more complex system. As always, with any of these systems, the darker you were, the closer to the bottom you were. And only recently, and by that I mean, again, probably in the last 15 years, particularly with the rise of a leftist government, president called Lula, who is a labor organizer in that government, and he had 2 terms. So during that term, they actually, for the first time, publicly acknowledged that Brazil had a racism problem. First time.
Really?
Yeah. And he actually established a whole ministry to undo racism in the country. Which obviously doesn't exist now under this current president. But it has been a very different, because again, having 200 different places to locate yourself, I mean, it did some real damage to people's identity and sense of self, right? But also because of the heavy presence of people of African descent, that culture could not be denied. So if you look at Brazilian culture, I mean, it is African-based, absolutely African-based.
I love it.
Right? Absolutely, right?
I love it.
Right?
Yeah.
So,
Jorge, I really appreciate your lecture. I'm reading by Ibram X. Kendi right now, Stamped from the Beginning, Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. And all that you're saying is, yeah, it's what I'm reading. And what really is so terrifying to me is using biology, quote, biology, to justify and enslave and annihilate people. I mean, they're not humans. So just wanted to comment on that. That's exactly what I'm reading. And I appreciate your lecture tonight.
Yeah. Thank you. And thank you again. This is what I think hopefully becomes another layer of understanding, as Kelly was saying. There's a global experience around this, right? And what Kendi brings up in his book, which is brilliant, by the way, right, is how deeply embedded, baked into the system, the language that we use, right? So it almost at some point becomes invisible. Like you don't even realize where that comes from. You just continue to use certain terminology, certain phraseology, but it is all deeply rooted in that. And once you put it in place, it just works like magic, right? On its own. Again, that idea of baking things into the system, baking things into the foundation of these nations was not unique to the United States. That's why, again, in Latin America, we also have that issue. I think we are in some ways behind, because at least in the United States, there was a civil rights movement. We didn't have one. We're just beginning to see the uprisings around that in Latin America, but we still have a really hard time talking about issues of race. Mostly, as Kelly's friends say, well, we don't have an issue of race. Oh yeah, but that caste system, yeah, I know about it. And we use this language. Oh yeah, but that's well, then before you know it, you keep adding things that are there, but it's like, well, you don't think they're about race? What are they, right? We've been brainwashed into not thinking about it that way. So thank you again for that sort of correlation, between two different places. Other thoughts, questions, reflections? Yeah.
Hi. I just want to thank you also for sharing with us tonight. There were a lot of things that were bubbling up for me as you spoke, but one of them in particular was when you talked about how when the indigenous people were murdered by the colonizers, it's portrayed as if they were just dying of diseases that they were, right? And when I was thinking about how I learned about that in school, it was I also absorbed this learning that was of their fault. It was their fault. They didn't have the immunity.
Right.
It was on them, right? And
yes.
It's just, there are so many ways in which we have been, taught or mistaught, miseducated.
Miseducated, yep.
And it seeps in deep. And I was also thinking about how organized they were in structuring the racism, right? Like to have over 200 categories, right? That required some defining, some communication, some reinforcement,
yes.
That is so organized. And yet when people are ready to be over conversations about race, they want us to just, in our hearts, love each other, and then it's all done, right? And it's there was so much work done to build this up, that equal amount of work needs to be done to dismantle it. So anyway, there were so many different things that have been running through my mind. I appreciate what you presented tonight, and I need to find some history books and dig in as well. So thank you for this time.
It. Sure.
Jorge, I wanted to mention one other thing. What really comes out in the whole caste system, and by the way, that's a great book to cast to think about our American system. But it really appeared in South Africa in an interesting place.